About 45 pages. I haven't been through the whole thing with you.
Yeah, I read the article. It's interesting. It's a little basis.
Good evening. If you'll join me, please, in a moment of silence for Linda Vest and her family, Councilor Linda Vest and her family. And now if you'll join me with the Pledge of Allegiance.
One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I now call the meeting to order, and I'm going to ask Rachel to take roll.
Planning Commission President and Councilor Bross-Ferganaro.
Here.
Councilor Chenoweth.
Here.
Councilor Kwanzo.
Present.
Councilor Friddle.
Here.
Councilor Guy.
Present.
Councilor Higgins.
Present.
Councilor Hinchman.
Here.
Councilor Lowther is absent. Councilor Parker is absent. And Councilor Vest is absent. Planning's Commission Vice President Talbot.
Here. Say here.
Member Summers.
She's not here.
Member Woods.
Here.
Member Colson.
Not here.
Member Woolwine.
Here.
And Member Marco. Okay, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Is there anyone here for public comment?
My name is Jennifer Griggs, and I live in Clint's district or ward. I'm still trying to figure out that information. I am a new resident, as well as my husband. We moved to the Elkins area in 2019, so this is the first time that I've really had a chance to look at the zoning ordinances that are proposed, and I just have a couple comments about it. Specifically, first of all, I applaud the taking on this task. I looked at your ones from the 1950s, and wow, that was very interesting. So congratulations for doing this, and it's really wonderful that you are. A couple things that were kind of hit me is you're very specific on some of your definitions that you then refer to in your zoning codes, specifically on the ones related to dwellings. And so as you go through these things, there was two specific things. It says dwelling single family means a detached building containing not more than one dwelling unit and not occupied by more than one family. And my concern with this is coming from other places, sometimes they're shared housing. There would be 3 nurses who are not related, and they all want to share the cost and live in a house. And from this and the information, it would look like the owner would have to ask for a variance to allow 3 different people living in a house. And so since there's very specific things on that, I was just not sure of that. I'm used to things called transitional housing, shared housing, things like that, that if you have are specific on there, that there's different types of housing just than single family housing or multi-family housing units. So I would just encourage that to be added or looked at. The other area that I tried to read the whole 90 pages, but I didn't give a chance, is there's a lot of information on signs. One of the things that I would think would be wonderful if there was some specific verbiage in there about political signs, that political signs could only be put up X amount of days before the election and should be taken down X amount of days after the election. You know, we all want to support our candidates for a variety of reasons, but I really don't see the need to have a political sign 4 years later still on someone's commercial property or a residential place. So that would be wonderful if that could be included. The other thing is, again, it's very specific, and I tried to find some additional definitions, but in group residential facility, you specifically mention developmentally disabled and behaviorally disabled persons, and I'm not sure of that definition. I don't know if you're using that definition from a psychology, if you're just using this, copying it from something else, but there's a lot of different people who may want to live in a group home situation that don't fall under those medical codes. So I didn't know if it was really a medical code or if it was just a generic definition. Habitable structure. I've never known a commercial or industrial building to be considered a habitable structure. In a habitable structure, my thought is if someone's house burns down and they have a building, I'll just say, XYZ building next to, Greenfield. And so I'm the owner and I say, you know what, I'm just gonna set up shop in this right now, put a bed, put a camping stove, that type of thing. In here, by the letter of the law, it would seem to say that that's considered a habitable structure. So I'm just not real sure about that definition. The last thing on here and my husband's here and he said, well, yes and no, but I'm gonna mention it. So one is on when we talk about zoning permits, it says no building or structure shall be constructed, erected, expanded, enlarged, or otherwise structurally altered until a zoning permit has been issued by the zoning officer. I don't know how specific that is. If I, as a homeowner, want to add on a garage or a bedroom, do I now have to go and get a zoning permit as well as a building permit? So some clarification on that would be wonderful. And then the final thing is, in your overview, you discuss what grandfathering is, but grandfathering is not listed in the zoning code with the definition. And as one of the proposed changes, you also say the framework for modern uses and higher quality reuse of existing properties. So if we're talking about grandfathering, I think there should be some additional discussion on grandfathering goes away at the sale of a property, specifically potentially for commercial uses. So if there's a commercial use that is sold, is it going to retain all of the grandfathering aspects that was there prior? I think that should be residential too. My husband disagrees on that. So those are the ones. But again, thank you so much for taking this on. I know this is a huge tackle you've been doing for 6 years, and I just hope that it's not too late to make some of these comments. Thank you.
No, not at all. Can I explain something real
Well,
quick?
it's public comment.
Okay,
That's
all right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else here for public comment? Okay, if not, we have a presentation on the study and report on zoning.
Good evening. I'm Christy Demuth, and I'm with the WVU College of Law Land Use and Sustainable Development Law Clinic, or just the Land Use Law Clinic, because that's shorter. And I've been working with the city of Elkins since we worked on the comprehensive plan, which was adopted in 2015. So I believe it's been since 2013, so almost 10 years. I was just telling Jerry, I have not been here since 2019, so it's nice to be back to see you all. So I just wanted to give a brief overview. I've been working with the Planning Commission on the zoning for what probably feels to them a very long time, because it was a massive overhaul of the zoning ordinance. And Elkins was one of the very first communities that we started working. The clinic is rather new to the College of Law. When we first started working with Elkins, we've been in existence now for 9 years, helping communities throughout West Virginia on land use issues. But at the time when we started working with Elkins, Elkins was one of my only clients. That has definitely changed. I have 15 now. And so it was kind of a learning process for both the city and for us at the clinic of the process and just working through some of these documents. So I think this has been discussed earlier, but there was a real need for the zoning ordinance to be updated to reflect the goals of the 2015 comprehensive plan. We spent the better part of 2 years working with the Planning Commission, going out to the public to see what they wanted the vision to be of the city in the next 10 years. That's what the comprehensive plan is, a 10-year vision. And what we heard from the public and from the Planning Commission was they would like to see better design and maintain the residential integrity of the city. They wanted to illustrate the city's commitment to planning that would attract both personal and commercial investment in the community. As you can imagine, having a zoning ordinance from the 1950s, that does detract from investment in the community. Protect residents from uncertainty by having well-defined zoning districts. prepare the city for the future by responding to challenges of contemporary uses such as agritourism and medical marijuana. And there's many more uses in this new zoning ordinance that obviously were not contemplated in the 1950s version. And then provide details to allow for better code enforcement, but also allow for flexibility with conditional parameters. And like it was mentioned earlier in the public comment, you can see there's a ton of definitions in the draft zoning ordinance. And I work with attorneys, and they like everything to be defined. That way there is, for the zoning officer, it is very easy for the zoning officer to say, this is what this use is, this is how we enforce it. So we like to have those definitions in there, and I think there's probably 50 pages of definitions in the draft zoning ordinance simply to help with enforcement and not to have a gray area. So the zoning ordinance process has been going on since 2015, so obviously a long time, and we have some original members of the Planning Commission, and we've had new members in the past couple months. So it has been quite a process. We actually completed our draft in 2019, January, and then since then, for the past 2 years, we have just been finalizing the draft. When I went through this with the Planning Commission, I didn't want to overwhelm them all at once. And so some of you that have sat in on meetings know that I would give sections at a time. So we would talk about signs, which I'll talk about that in a little bit, but that felt like, 12 meetings we talked about signs. We would talk about parking at one meeting. We would talk about the different zoning districts at one meeting. And so we did that to just not overwhelm everyone. And then we took the time as the clinic to put it all together. And that is what we presented to the Planning Commission back in January of 2019. So in 2019, they got the final draft, and then they got to look at it as a whole. And then obviously they had some comments seeing it all together as one document. And we were working quite steadily on that in 2019, and then in 2020, the pandemic happened, and that kind of slowed the process down a little bit. We actually had 40 Planning Commission meetings, so this is something that all those Planning Commission meetings were open to the public. We did have people attend to talk about maybe specific concerns they had with the final draft. Only 9 of those meetings was held on Zoom due to the pandemic, so, over 90% of these meetings were open to the public in person. So there was a lot of opportunity to provide input. And we also held 2 open houses to get a general feeling of the community and what they wanted to see in the final draft zoning ordinance. The first one we held in January of 2018 in the depot, I believe, and we had a decent turnout where we had a draft zoning map, we had the use table that I'll show you in a little bit, and we just generally talked about what was going to be in the ordinance, and we got some great feedback from that. And then we had a more specific open house in September the same year to talk about historic design guidelines in the Weiss Historic District, to see if there was interest in preserving that historic district by putting some language in the zoning ordinance. And from what we heard from that meeting, the public was not interested at that time. So we kind of, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit, but we kind of backed off that because there didn't seem to be a real interest. And we also did an online survey to gauge interest as well in that. So backing up to the comprehensive plan, that was also spearheaded by the Planning Commission. It's the process of the community's vision and what it aspires to be in the future. It serves as a blueprint for future development, and it's a policy document. It's not regulation, it's not set in stone, it's something City Council and the Planning Commission can use to guide development through the next 10 years. And it'll need to be updated in 2025. So just to give you a little bit of input on the Planning Commission, it's a group of citizens that's appointed by City Council, and they advise City Council on planning matters. They're responsible for preparing the comprehensive plan and also preparing land use ordinances, such as the zoning ordinance, and then also if the city were to do a subdivision and land development ordinance, that is something the Planning Commission would also spearhead. And then lastly, the Planning Commission reviews and proposes amendments to the zoning ordinance. So for instance, if somebody has a rezoning request, that would go before the Planning Commission. They would make a recommendation based on the comprehensive plan, and then they would forward that to City Council for final approval. So this is just to give you an idea of who's been on the Planning Commission. Now this is the current Planning Commission. I know there are many members of City Council that at one point were on the Planning Commission. But these are our current members. Nancy, I think, is our longest serving member. I'm not sure if that's good and bad in your mind. But she has been on the Planning Commission since 2012. Kate is not here, but she's been on the Planning Commission since 2015, and she's been great because she actually has a degree in planning. So her input has been very valuable. And then we have Bob, who's been in since 2019, and Duke since 2020. And you can see all the members of the Planning Commission represent a wide range of interests in the city. You can see they're very involved in the community. We have professors, we have former mayors, so we've tried to, the city council really tried to get a wide cross-section of people to represent the city on the Planning Commission. The mayor is on the Planning Commission as well. Mr. Woods, he's one of our newest members. And then Phillips is also one of our newest members. So they kind of got thrown in the fire in the last couple meetings, seeing a final draft zoning ordinance for the very first time, 90 pages, which with really no context whatsoever. But their input has been great too, because they're seeing it with new eyes, where we've seen this for the past 6 years and we might miss some things. So I know Jessica sent everyone a copy of the study and report on zoning. And so I'm going to briefly describe what that is and why that is something that we're doing. And it's actually a West Virginia code requirement. So the West Virginia code requires the Planning Commission and City Council to study the land within their city after the adoption of a comprehensive plan and before enacting a zoning ordinance, and then use that information from the study and the comprehensive plan to prepare a report on zoning. So if you read the study and report on zoning, it basically gives a summary of why we are changing the zoning ordinance. We're basically replacing the city's current zoning ordinance, and what the process was of going through that. So it also gives the entire draft zoning ordinance and the maps and all the restrictions for each district. So it's basically just a summary of what we put into the final draft. And I briefly mentioned this before, but we looked at the city of Elkins during the comprehensive plan, all the public meetings we held, and we just heard a lot about maintaining the historic charm of the community, more landscaping and buffers and new development. Signage was a big issue, especially on your gateways into the city, like Randolph Avenue. Abandoned buildings was a major concern, and then commercial development fitting in with the character. And the current zoning ordinance is basically from 1959 with no major updates since 1979. So it just made sense to update the zoning ordinance to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So basically, though, when we started going through that 50 zoning ordinance, we realized there was not too much that we could salvage to use, because as you can imagine, there's just so many different types of uses now that weren't even contemplated back in the 50s. We did use the draft zoning ordinance map, and I'll show that in the slide here in a little bit, as the basis for the new zoning map. So I will say I don't think the zoning districts changed too much. We did add a few districts and define them a little more clear. But I think generally, because Elkins is built out at this point, the districts are going to stay the same. We organized and simplified the zoning ordinance in a logical and user-friendly format. And I'm going to show you here. Sutton, if I mess this up, I might need you to help me. I want to show you what we did, because I know I hear from a lot of zoning officers that the zoning ordinance can be unwieldy and they can't find things in it. And so at the clinic, we have tried really hard to make our document just easy to read. Okay, here we go. So at the end of the ordinance, now it is 90 pages, but that's because 40 of the pages are definitions, and there's just no way around that. But at the end of the document, yeah, is it not projecting? I just wanted to show the use table. So what we did was we created this use table. As you can imagine, there is so many different types of uses that can be contemplated: residential, commercial, industrial. And so we have it's 5-page list of uses that we have defined in the zoning ordinance. And what we have done is put them in a table so that the zoning officer could just open this table up and say, okay, retail under 5,000 square feet is allowed in the CBD district. Is it not coming up? That's okay. And so that is just really helpful for the zoning officer and the city to post on the website. So if a developer's coming in, they can look at that use table and say, okay, my use is allowed in XYZ district. They don't have to dig through the entire ordinance to find that. And I encourage you to look at that use table since I can't show it. We also added new sign, landscaping, and parking regulations. Signs, I feel like, will be the death of me because and Jerry and I have had a lot of discussions about this. The U.S. Supreme Court decided a case a few years ago that really changed sign law throughout the country. And really, a lot of communities had content-based regulations. You cannot regulate signs based on the content of the message. You can only regulate signs based on the height of the sign, the type of sign. So we spent months going through the sign regulations and trying to craft something that fit in with the character of the city of Elkins. And actually there is another Supreme Court case that they're gonna probably hear this fall that could totally change all that again. So that is just an evolving issue, but it did take us a lot of time because that was a court case that came out as we were working on the zoning ordinance, so we had to adapt and make sure our language was not content-based. So that might be why it seems like the sign chapter is very confusing, but it's because we had to meet those federal requirements. We also added landscaping requirements for new development and parking regulations, and I'll go into a little more detail about that as we go further along. We also have a detailed list of supplemental regulations in the zoning ordinance. So there's a lot of uses that you're okay maybe permitting them by right in, say, the central business district. But there are just some issues, particular considerations, maybe noise or parking or traffic that you're a little concerned about. And so what we did with the Planning Commission is we went through those uses and decided what uses that they would like to see additional restrictions on, and we added those in the zoning ordinance. And then lastly, we just recently, actually in the past few months, the Land Use Clinic finalized our telecommunications template ordinance. This is something else that's regulated at the federal level. There's really not much municipalities can do in terms of telecommunications. A lot of that comes down from the federal government. And at the clinic, we came out with a model ordinance to regulate basically cell phone towers and other types of communication devices. You have to allow them somewhere within city limits, but you can have reasonable restrictions on requiring them to co-locate if possible, or to have aesthetic design considerations. So for instance, at WVU, the stadium, there's a cell phone tower there, but it looks like a tree. You can require cell phone companies to do that. So we actually added that into the zoning ordinance in the past few months. So I talked about signs a little bit, and that's, if you have any specific questions, I can talk about that as we move along. We also added urban agriculture. There has been a real movement in urban agriculture. Basically chickens has been a huge controversy in a lot of communities. So we have a whole section about backyard chickens, and that even goes further to other types of livestock and bees and composting and whatnot. So we included a lot of regulations about urban agriculture. We also added a use for the zoning for the conversion of old schools and churches. A lot of times, for instance, you have an old school in a neighborhood and your zoning ordinance doesn't allow that school to be developed for anything but residential. And maybe that's just not possible. Maybe the investment just can't be made, the return on investment. And so there is a specific use that allows for conversion of old schools and churches in, maybe residential communities. So we contemplated that in the zoning ordinance as well. And then this actually was brought about after we received some comments from, I think, business owners in the central business district that for parking in the central business district, they should be exempt from parking requirements because this would allow for the needs of small businesses and encourage the creation of more retail spaces. If you required parking in the downtown, that might limit people from investing in the downtown. So we included that change as well. So one of the concerns we heard from the public, even back in the comprehensive plan process, was the residential districts were not protecting the character of existing single-family neighborhoods. There was only one commercial district on the old zoning map, and I'll show that in a second, and it did not protect small-scale commercial development. And you have Davis and Elkins College, and then you do have some other land that is right now agriculture, and there was, really no good district that those types of uses fit into. And this is the current zoning map, as you can see. So you can see where Davis and Elkins up in the right-hand corner is zoned, I think that is residential. And Davis and Elkins is it's a college. It's really not conducive to that type of zoning. So we actually created an educational zoning district to meet their needs. And we had discussions with them on what that should include. To help them, keep the character of their campus. And we also included some other educational uses in that category as well. So the new zoning map, we have a single-family residential district, we have a city residential district, recreational, CBD, which is your downtown, commercial, educational, industrial, and agriculture. And I'll go through each one. And I just want to give a huge shout out to Ben for the maps. It is great to have somebody working with somebody that knows GIS, because we've had some issues with this parcel data and going back and forth. We've shared many emails, and in a lot of my communities I don't have a Ben. So it was just very great to have him and help me out with the mapping, and I think it'll be really great because before you just have a PDF of a current zoning map, where this will be parcel based. You can click on somebody's parcel and you'll know what their zoning classification is. So this will just be really good for the zoning officer in enforcing the zoning ordinance. So this is the map here, and then let me go through each district, and we have the maps big as well in front of me here. So the yellow is single family residential. That's to preserve the single-family neighborhoods by discouraging multifamily dwellings in business, commercial, and industrial uses. So we heard a lot from the people that live in the R1 district that they did not want to see their neighborhood turn into multifamily dwellings. So and I believe they're yellow on the map. Yeah. So those areas will preserve single-family. We do allow home-based businesses, though. So if somebody wants to operate a business out of their house, that will be permitted. And then you have the city residential district, which is to encourage a variety of housing. So this will allow, multifamily, townhouses, duplexes, and whatnot. And then we also have limited low-impact commercial, community, and recreational facilities in this district. The recreational district was created specifically for the parks in the city, because I think before they were lumped in the residential district. So this allows the parks to be in a specific category. And then the CBD is your downtown district, which would be to encourage a mix of commercial and residential uses, and provide convenient, pedestrian-oriented businesses that meet the needs of residents in the neighborhood and surrounding neighborhoods. And then this is a district we added because we felt that the CBD is totally different than the commercial corridors coming into city limits. So this would be more for larger scale commercial businesses that both serve the city and the traveling public coming through the town. And the educational district, like I mentioned earlier, is for the D&E campus, and then there's also a few other areas we classified as educational. And those are for buildings and the uses associated with those instructional activities. So lodging, health and safety, and entertainment needs of the student population.
Would you mind telling us what color each of these districts
Yeah.
are?
So
Please remember to use your microphone. Thank you.
let's see. Yellow is single family. Orange is the city residential, so that's more the multifamily housing. The red is the commercial corridors, so that is coming in Harrison and then Randolph. The CBD is the pink, so that's right here. The blue is the educational, and I believe Industrial is purple, so that's actually where your industrial already is within city limits. The green is the city parks, and then the light green is agriculture, which I'll talk about in a second. And if you have any questions specific about the map afterwards, I'll be glad to answer them. Okay, so the agriculture district this is something we added on, I think, toward the end of the process, because it seems strange that there would be an agriculture district within city limits. But there are some areas down, the bottom part of the map that are existing agriculture. And then also thinking in the future, if the city would annex land in, a lot of that land might be agriculture in nature. So it just made sense to create an agriculture district now. And then lastly, we have the telecommunications overlay. So like I mentioned earlier, the city has to allow telecommunications somewhere within city limits. And you have to be very careful where you allow it. You can't allow it somewhere where it's so limiting that it really couldn't happen. The federal government is definitely going to take issue with that. And so we had a lot of discussions with the Planning Commission where the best location for telecommunications would be. And we created a specific overlay, which is up in this area here, because of the topography of this area was just more conducive to telecommunications. And then also there's existing towers up there as well. And then I believe we also allow them in industrial. So we think by allowing them there in industrial that's pretty well covered for the city. Okay, so that was more specific about the city zoning ordinance. Now, I know there might be a lot of questions about just common zoning questions. So one of the questions, the public might be concerned about is, what if my property is zoned differently than the way I'm using it now? And that's actually referred to as grandfathering. That's just what everybody calls it. But actually in the ordinance, that would be non-conforming. So there's a whole section in the ordinance called non-conforming uses, structures, and lots that explains exactly the process for non-conforming uses. The use may continue even if it's sold. If somebody buys it, they're still allowed to keep that non-conforming use. However, there are limits on the expansion of non-conforming uses. And I'd have to look at the details in the ordinance, but I think we did limit, you can't put, if you have a non-conforming structure, you might be limited on putting an addition or whatnot. So there is some limitations, but the use can continue. Now this is West Virginia code. This is not something the Planning Commission decided, but once a non-conforming use becomes abandoned for 1 year, it cannot revert back to the original non-conforming use. And that's West Virginia code, the 1 year timeline. And we do have a section in the zoning ordinance that talks about what is abandonment, because that could be up to interpretation. So we have specific criteria of what abandoned means in the zoning ordinance. Another question I think especially is relevant due to the pandemic is, can I have a business in my home? So there's two types of home-based businesses. There's the no impact, where you just work from your house, and you have no off-premise, nobody come into your house, you have no customer-client interaction, no pickup or delivery or anything associated with your business. So it could just be an accountant working out of their home, but they're not having clients in there. That would be a no-impact home-based business. And those are permitted by right in the agriculture, single-family, city residential, central business district, commercial, educational, and industrial zoning districts. And then you have home-based business, low impact. And that's the type of business that maybe they're going to have customer visitation or clients or merchandise deliveries. For instance, you'll see one of the communities I worked at before I came to the clinic, there was a controversy over a home-based business that was an attorney working from her home, and she had a lot of people coming in and out and clients. And residents were concerned that the traffic coming and going was disrupting the quality of life of the neighborhood. So we had those discussions with the Planning Commission, and we decided that those types of home-based businesses would be permitted by right in the agriculture, central business district, commercial, and educational zoning districts, but in the single family and the city residential zoning district, they are conditional uses. And conditional uses are uses that have to go before the Board of Zoning Appeals. And there would be a public hearing, and they would make the case as to why they felt that their use should be allowed. And then the Board of Zoning Appeals would hear that testimony. There's a whole section in the zoning ordinance about conditional uses and the standards they must follow. And the Board of Zoning Appeals can say, okay, you're allowed to have your business, but these are the conditions we're going to put on it. So for instance, you have to close at 9 o'clock. You can't have any deliveries after 8 o'clock. So you can put conditions on those type of uses, just to protect the surrounding property owners. So, or they could deny the use because there could be an impact to the city at large. Another question we hear a lot is, what if I want to develop my property differently from the way that it was zoned? If you want to develop your property and the zoning ordinance does not allow that, you can request a rezoning. And that would go before the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission with advice would look at the comprehensive plan and then ultimately make a recommendation to City Council, and then City Council would have the ultimate say if there should be rezoning. This is one I hear a lot, especially in communities that have never had zoning. They are afraid zoning is going to increase their property taxes. Property taxes are based on the assessed value of real property. The county assessor is responsible for determining the value every year for the fair market value. Taxes are then determined by multiplying that rate against the assessed value. So the updates to the zoning ordinance, or really any zoning ordinance, is not going to increase property taxes. They're based on the current use of the land and the market values, not what the property is zoned. Now, zoning of property could affect somebody selling their property and marketing their property zoned a specific way. Maybe they can get a better price, but it's not going to affect the taxes. And I mentioned the Board of Zoning Appeals. They're an important part of this zoning ordinance because they are the ones that are going to have to hear the challenges and the conditional use permits. So anytime the zoning officer, decides something, say somebody comes to his office and wants to do something and he denies it, that person can then appeal that to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So this is a very important body, and they would hold a public hearing and hear that appeal. And then they also hear the conditional use permits. They are a quasi-judicial board, and they render decisions, and they actually have to write findings of fact and conclusions of law. And so it's very important that the BZA is trained in the zoning ordinance and what it takes to hold these meetings. Because ultimately, a decision that is appealed from the BZA would then go to circuit court. And this would be 5 residents appointed by City Council. So our next steps going forward. So we had a lot of talk about how to be transparent with the city. And we debated how we wanted to go about presenting this even to City Council. Because the study and report actually, when that is officially complete, there would need to be an official presentation of the study and report. Tonight we decided is just more informational, so I could present the information to you and then you could ask me questions or send me questions after the meeting. And then go back to the Planning Commission, work with the Planning Commission on any questions, concerns you may have, finalize that draft again, hear from the public, and then have an official presentation. So this is kind of the first step of the process, just to get the information out there, because it is a 90-page document to review. As I mentioned, the implementation, you can have this great, wonderful zoning ordinance, but if you don't enforce it and you don't implement it, it's really not worth anything. So at the Land Use Clinic, we do training throughout the state. We hold conferences every year. I'm actually training a BZA next week. We offer trainings to BZA members, Planning Commission members on what they need to do. So writing those findings of fact and conclusions of law, how the BZA would go about doing that. So that's something going forward we need to consider. And then also exploring the possibility of increasing resources in the Code Enforcement Office to enforce and assist with the proposed regulations. So I know that was a lot, and I know it's a huge document. So I don't know, do we want to open it up to questions?
Yes.
And I can answer her questions too.
And she left, unfortunately. One of the things that I would have mentioned to the resident that had come for public comment was that this is totally the first step, and that there will be 2 more opportunities for public comment in the future once this is proceeded in the sort of the timeline that it has to go through. And so I'm sad that she left before listening to any type of response. And another thing I wanted to mention was that on top of the sheet, the backgrounder sheet that Sutton put together, which was phenomenal, which was great, there is a website mentioned where people can get information about this whole process, see all the documents, City of Elkins, West Virginia.com /zoning-update. And another thing that I wanted to remind people was that when Jessica first sent out these documents, she did request that if you had any written comments, she did provide a deadline, and I thought I'd just mention that again to you all. No later than midnight, July 26th, and send any comments directly to Jessica. And I would like to also take a moment to thank the people that have been a part of this process for so many years, and it sort of all started with Duke getting a planning commission actually established in the city years and years ago. So just keep all those things in mind, and feel free to ask Christy anything.
May I say something? One of the things I think was answered during Christie's presentation when the lady that had the concern about what's grandfathering. Well, it is defined. It's not called that,
Right.
but it's non-conforming. Right. So perhaps that may allay her concerns about, well, what is grandfathering? Because that really is what you're talking about. And some of the other things that she spoke about have been considered, and I don't think there was anything she mentioned that you all haven't looked at and put some time and thought into what you put in your proposal. But as you had pointed out, this is just an informing session for council. There's actually some steps that have to be taken by law that will come down the road with regard to before it ever gets to the place that it's in the order that it's going to actually become the law of the city. But I think that what I would hope that folks would do is anyone that's on council that has never served on the planning commission or is unaware of kind of what all's gone into this, that there are some of the members here tonight, you know who the others are that aren't perhaps present. I think it's really important to have that communication, reach out to them about it. Why is it this or why is it that? It's a lot to look at, and it's a lot to comprehend, but it is very detailed, and I believe that you've covered about all you possibly can with all the scenarios. And what is most helpful in this, beyond all of the personal work that Christy has done for this city, since the Land Use Clinic is working with many cities throughout the state, they've actually put together things that will work. And they've looked at all the unique needs of different cities. So there's that added benefit you get. You know, you could have worked with someone that is a planner, which Christy actually is, and there are all kinds of people out there that do that. But because you have the benefit of the Land Use Clinic and all the work it's done from every city that they've worked with, cities the size of Elkins and some larger cities, I think that's a real benefit you've got with regard to sort of a template that you have on some of the major things that every city is going to deal with, whether it's signs or whatever it is. And as Christy mentioned, there's another case that may change what the town of Gilbert case did a couple years ago, but we'll just have to wait and see. And if so, we'll deal with that down the road. But for the benefit of members of council, just so you understand, there are numerous people within the clinic, lawyers and planners and other folks that have worked with other cities and what did you say, Chris, you're up to 15 now?
Oh, it's even more than that. I've lost track.
Yeah. So fortunately, we got on the ground level.
Yeah.
We
You're one of the first.
Yeah, we were fortunate enough to have you all say yes when we approached you about, hey, we see what you're doing for Fayetteville. Could you help us
I'm
with
still
our
there in
comprehensive plan?
Fayetteville.
And they're still one of your folks, aren't they? So in any event, that's a little background for those that are new to council or that have not been on the planning commission. It's an incredible document, and it does take some real reading and understanding. But here's your chance to talk to the person that's really been instrumental in putting this together for this city and for many other cities who have common needs that Elkins has.
I would just like to thank you, all of you, for an incredible amount of work. And I remember being at the first meeting at the depot.
At the
and
depot.
It was pretty, there was a lot of people there. And it was pretty exciting to think about the undertaking of what you were doing. So thank you very much. The one question that she brought up about signs for political signs.
Yeah.
It's a state law, is it not?
So that's one of those. So you cannot call out political signs specifically because that's content-based. If you have to look at, if you're regulating based on the message of the sign, that's content-based. So you can only regulate political signs as temporary signs, and you would have to regulate all temporary signs in the same manner. So there's been a lot of changes because of that content-based distinction. And so
I
that's
have a
one
quick
thing
question.
you really can't.
On that, specifically, there's been some signage or flags with some profane language.
I'm hearing a lot of that.
Is that fall under the content base, or is there any
So yeah, I actually had a
exception?
community call me that was upset about a certain flag and asked what they could do. And so Jesse looked up, I think it had the F word on it. And there is I don't think it's Supreme Court, but there is a case that says the F word is protected
It is.
language.
It is. I mean, you know, what you're talking about, Clint, it may be inappropriate. It may seem irresponsible. It may be the kind of thing you would prefer your children and grandchildren don't see because you try to teach them not to do those sorts of things or say those sort of things. But there's a wide protection with freedom of speech, and all you'd be doing is buying yourself a lawsuit if you're trying to regulate those. You know, so perhaps it's a teaching moment if you have young people that see it or whatever, to explain that, you know, it's one of those things that you hope they don't do. There are other ways to describe your dissatisfaction or your support for someone other than the person that they are commenting on in the flag or the sign. It's just one of those things that there's not a lot you can do, and it's a pretty national problem, frankly. So.
And I'm also getting calls from zoning officers about my neighbor's mad because they still haven't taken down the election signs. And once again, you can't regulate that. So.
Yeah, I think the only regulation I'm aware of that's out there is the Department of Highways. First of all, you're not supposed to put them on their rights of way. And if you do, they're going to get removed, and they have to be removed within a certain period of time. But that's the only law I'm aware of in West Virginia.
I'm sorry, what did you say about that?
I said that the Department of Highways does not want you to put political signs on their rights of way. People do. And sometimes they go remove them, actually, or if they don't, they make it clear that they've got to be down within a certain period of time after an election. And frankly, responsible candidates and their committees ought to be out there doing that as soon as the election's over, really. But that doesn't always happen either. But it's like yard sale signs, you know. If you're going to regulate temporary signs, and that's one of them too, that could fall into the same category as political signs. If you're going to say within so many days after the event, they've got to be removed, and where you can place them. I mean, you're allowed to do those kind of things. You just can't regulate what it says.
And we spent a lot of time on the types of signs. Like there's I'm sure the planning commission knows, there's just, I don't know, 30 different types of signs. Wall signs, monument signs, freestanding signs, the inflatables, just person-assisted signs. So somebody standing out with a tax sign, that's a sign. So we spent a lot of time on what types of signs should be allowed in each zoning district to fit in with the character. And that's in the sign chapter, because you can at least regulate the aesthetics of the sign. So, and the height and the dimensions.
And the type.
Yeah.
And the type, and, for various places. I don't want anyone to think that when and if this is totally completed and it's passed and it is now part of the Elkins City Code, that all of a sudden what the city looks like is going to change. It's just not. Because obviously there are many non-conforming uses that will continue in that regard. But what your goal is by doing this is to look down the road and look at what you can do and what you can do with regard to future use, future development. And that's really the responsible thing a community ought to be doing, because things certainly have changed since the 1950s, when the main zoning ordinance that's still in effect was put in place. It was a very different world then, and people certainly didn't have a lot of things available to do now that you would never have thought about at that point.
I'm curious about the landscaping for commercial property, people who are coming into the city and want to do landscaping. How is that going to, well, I guess we don't know yet, but how would that be enacted? I mean, how would the city interact with, I guess, through building permits, or I don't know?
So that actually was a question from the lady earlier that I wanted to address about, if she would add on a garage or a bedroom, would she need a zoning permit? And the answer is yes, because you want to make sure they're meeting all the setback requirements and the height requirements. And we've actually worked with communities to develop some template zoning permits. They're usually a one-page. Communities can charge, they usually don't charge a lot for them, but it's to mainly make sure that they're meeting your zoning requirements, because if there's not a permit process, then people could throw up sheds or swimming pools or whatnot, and they might not meet, typically it's setbacks for those types of things if they're not meeting those requirements. So the same thing would be for a commercial development. If they would come in, then there needs to be a permit process that they go through, and to see, for instance, landscaping, you have to put X, Y, and Z. You might have to put a buffer in if you're next to a single-family residential dwelling. That's all laid out in the zoning ordinance.
Okay.
Well, and the thing is too, Marilyn, if you're looking at most commercial developers, first place they're going to go if they know the properties within a municipality is call the city hall and say, so what are your guidelines about development? I mean, if you're a national chain, you're putting up a particular, they know those things exist. And so they're going to ask, as part of the building permit process, what are the restrictions about landscaping? What about signs? What about number of parking spaces? All of those things. They're very used to doing that.
So that's the code enforcement's department, or who would be responsible?
Well, that's going to be the question, and that's been discussed, is, who's going to be enforcing the zoning ordinance? In many places, it is part of your code enforcement, because it makes sense that it would fit there naturally because of building permits, because of the standard building codes, the international building code that the state's adopted, the IPMC, and all those things. So that's the natural fit for it. And that's where many cities have a particular part of their code enforcement or their building department, whatever you call it, that handles the zoning permits.
Okay.
And then, of course, as Christy pointed out, your BZA, your Board of Zoning Appeals, and I believe you currently have 2 vacancies on it. You had one, and I believe a longtime member resigned. It's going to be very important when you appoint the new folks to replace them, that you're thinking about someone that's going to have the time to have a training session with the land use clinic, so they understand really what their role is, because sometimes it gets confusing, and sometimes they think that their job is to grant variances in every situation, when that really isn't their job. So you have a couple vacancies, and you have a good opportunity to look at appointments for folks that will be ready to take on that responsibility. And it's, everyone on that board's going to have to learn, obviously, but you'll have two brand-new people to fill the vacancies.
I kind of feel like we've already transitioned into our new business, which is a joint review and discussion of the study and report. So I think we probably should move forward with that. I mean, you're going to be available to answer questions, obviously, correct? Since we're doing the joint review and discussion of the study and report of zoning, including draft zoning ordinances and zoning map.
And I will say, to address some of the questions earlier about single-family dwellings for families, family is defined in the zoning ordinance as, two people related by blood or 5 unrelated individuals. So you can have up to, or 4 unrelated individuals. And that's in the zoning ordinance. And then one of the other questions was about group residential facility, what was developmental disability and behavior disability. That actually is all regulated by the West Virginia State Code, and they have definitions in the West Virginia State Code. And there are a lot of items, like the non-conforming, the BZA, that are regulated by the West Virginia State Code that, have to be in the zoning ordinance. Does anybody else have any questions?
I had a couple, and hopefully they're appropriately addressed to you. Actually, this is something that Burley had directed my attention to. Under the uses map here, we've got under recreational, we've got some group residential facilities and group residential homes. What's that all about?
So that's the West Virginia State Code saying that you have to allow group residential facilities and group residential homes basically in every zoning district.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's just.
Can't change
Yeah.
that.
Gotcha.
That's the state preempting local authority.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I had a couple other things here too. Actually, one probably more specifically. So we had talked, I think, a couple council meetings ago about a riverfront study that was done.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, I don't know, if we're going to have a trail running through there, if we need some, I don't know, more appropriate zoning for like our industrial areas.
Yeah, and
because
that's
it
something
very likely
that
run through there.
Jessica recently brought to our attention.
Okay, all right.
And so, I have not yet looked at that, but at the next planning commission meeting, I think we're gonna look at that area and see, to make sure it aligns with the vision of that area. But that's definitely on our radar.
Cool, yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty much all I had, so thank you.
I think that brings up a real reality of this document, is that every time when we thought we were ready to go forward with it, then you had medical marijuana, and then we had the cell phone tower issues, and so the reality is we are always going to have to amend and revise this document, that this will not, be a something that's been chiseled in stone. It's something more that has to respond to what's happening around us, and that's what we've had to do for 6 years. And the commission basically felt that with all the knowledge that Christy brought with her whole group, that we really needed to move forward with a zoning ordinance, because things are happening in the city without the proper regulation and without a means of enforcing anything. So that's why we sort of felt like, let's get this out here and let's talk about it. Some of the things that are really important to remember, and Christy talked about that, was the conditional use. That is such an amazing opportunity to really respond to individual neighborhoods, individual residences, really respond to concerns that came up all the time when we had our public meetings, that people felt a little powerless about what was happening in their immediate surroundings. So this gives It doesn't say absolutely not, this use will not be allowed, but we want to think about this. We want to hear individual concerns, and then the city wants the ability to say, okay, that's cool, but you have to change your hours. You have to be mindful of those who surround you. So I think that's, when you go through the chart, really look at that. Really, it's not a total negation of an idea, but it's one that we really want to think about this a little bit more. And you can over-regulate up the wazoo, but we figured that it would be better to have it conditional, and then let's talk about it. Let's see. If it's not an acceptable use, then it won't happen. But we wanted a chance to have a dialogue and really be responsive to the needs of the community.
Well, Nancy, I agree. This will be a living document as times change and progress. And you guys are talking about the 6 years that you've been working on this, but you got to realize you've been updating for 70 years worth of work. So, I mean, 6 years really isn't that long when you're doing 70 years worth of updates. So I commend you guys for that.
And this, since I'm able to show you now, this is the use table I referenced earlier. So you can see that, we have all the different uses here listed with the zoning districts on top, and then if they're permitted by right, which would be P, or conditional. So for instance, bed and breakfast are conditional in single family, because obviously that could impact the surrounding property owners in the neighborhood, and having a hearing before the BZA would be appropriate. And so this, I think it's like 5 or 6 pages of every type of use that is defined in the zoning ordinance, and then it details of it. And then if it's blank, it's not allowed in that zoning district. And just since I have this up, just to kind of give you, because I know it's overwhelming if you've never seen it, kind of an overview of the document. So the first part is just, the purpose, the scope, interpretation. Honestly, nothing really exciting. The second part is the administration and enforcement. Most of this, like 99.9%, is West Virginia State Code. It talks about the powers and duties of the zoning officer. The zoning permit is mentioned. It talks about the fees. So for instance, when this is enacted, council will have to then adopt a fee schedule. I'm guessing the fee schedule might not have been looked at either, and so we have a sample fee schedule that we've created so that you can charge the appropriate amount for some of these permits. It talks about amendments, the powers and duties of the BZA, what happens when the BZA, there's an appeal, variances, conditional use standards. So there's this whole section on conditional uses. That conditions can be put on a use based on, to address location and the activities on the site, noise and glare, hours of operation and deliveries, location of loading and unloading, light intensity, the placement of outdoor vending machines, loitering, litter control, placement of trash receptacles, on-site parking, on-site circulation, and privacy concerns. So it goes into detail about that. Then you have the non-conforming section where we talk about non-conforming uses, structures, and lots. Then enlargement or an extension of a non-conforming use is discussed. And then the next part is the definitions, which is probably, 40 to 50 pages of definitions. Then we have the supplemental regulations I had discussed earlier. So for instance, we have supplemental regulations on car washes. So they might be permitted in one of the zoning districts, but we're saying they have to have a distance between any buildings in any residential district shall be 50 feet. Their lighting has to be shielded so it deflects away from adjacent property owners. They have to have a fence. The area has to be utilized, all the areas utilized for washing and drying shall be paved. If it's next to a residentially zoned area, they can only operate between 6 and 10 p.m. And then it talks about the parking. So you can see that, some of these uses are permitted in the corresponding zoning districts, but will have some additional requirements. So that's that entire section, the urban agriculture, video lottery. And then you have general regulations. This is where we talk about accessory uses, buildings and structures, and the setbacks, yard requirements, fences, landscaping, and screening. So that's where you can find this information in here. Lot lines and irregular lots, storage of trailers, camping and recreational equipment, performance standards, lighting, and then a whole section on parking, and how many spaces for each use. Off-street loading, temporary uses, and then it goes into the signs. And I'm not gonna go, so you can see these tables here are for each zoning district, the max sign area, dimensions, and heights, and then above it talks about the types of signs that are allowed. And then the last section is, which is a huge document in itself, is the wireless telecommunications ordinance, but that is regulated by the federal government, and that's why it's a lengthy section. Any other questions?
I think it's just another comment. When Chrissy was talking about urban agriculture, I mean, that was just a fascinating effect of the COVID 2020. We had to respond to all these folks that are, now keeping bees and chickens and things like that. So again, it's another example of being a living document. And, when you go through this, it is wonderful how Christy and her group did try to make this as user-friendly as possible, just the part about the signs and what type of signs, and there's, like she said, oodles of different definitions of signs. What is allowed in each district? It's all right there divided up by district. So this is a very, I know it's overwhelming, but I'm so grateful that everybody is here this evening, because this is such an important part of our roadmap into the future. So really take some time, do communicate with us by that deadline, because we will be meeting again as soon as we get those comments in. And I also, sorry, I'm also so appreciative of all the work that Sutton did to get this out to the major stakeholders ahead of time, because the last thing that we wanted to have happen was somebody feel like they were blindsided by this document. During the whole process, like what Chrissy alluded to, we were in communication with the college to see what needs that they had. They had come to one of our community hearings and just said, we really have some concerns about this. Sat down with them, got their input on it. The fact that this has been given out already to folks like the Chamber and RCDA is great, and hopefully we will get good input and a good response from that. But I appreciate all the transparency. Having that one-pager was awesome. I think it was so important to the public to understand what this document is about.
Is there any possibility to extend the date from the 26th?
Yeah,
I mean,
I guess that's up to the planning
to at
commission.
least to the end of the month? Is that possible? I mean,
Sure,
it's a lot to
okay.
go through.
I know.
And I really would like to go through it.
Okay. Sure.
I think Friday, July 30th is a Friday,
Yeah,
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, if you're thinking, if
Yeah.
someone wants it to the end of the month, if you want it by the end of that business week,
That would be
That's the
great.
30th.
30th, right?
Yeah,
Correct.
That sounds fine.
Sounds reasonable. Thank you.
Any other comments, questions, discussions? So Part B of this is our next steps forward, and I'm guessing that's the extension to the 30th now for feedback. So I think we've covered that at this point. Is that correct?
Yeah, and just a little, because Sutton was asking me about the process, so just to give you, you know, what happens next. So we'll meet with the planning commission, we'll go over any comments. I know we have to address the riverfront questions. And then there'll be an official, this I guess isn't official tonight, there'll be an official presentation of the study and report again with the final document. And then after that, all that needs to be done is city council holds 2 public hearings, one during the day and one in the evening. And that's a West Virginia code requirement. I get a lot of communities that don't like the during the day one, but that's a West Virginia code requirement. So there needs to be a quorum with those. And then the ordinance would be enacted at a city council meeting, and then there needs to be 2 readings. I
Correct.
don't know why they make it so convoluted, but that's the process, you know, moving forward.
Well, thank you very much for your time today.
You're welcome.
Any other comments or questions?
We couldn't have done it without you.
So true.
Oh, my gosh.
My goodness, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you. This is Chrissy's first live and in person.
I actually went somewhere last week, so
Oh, yeah, so
but
we appreciate it.
it feels weird being back. Get
Great.
used to being on Zoom.
Thanks.
Okay, then I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you.
We all need a break.
So where are your grandkids?
My truck's still in the shop. I can call Kenny James.
Yeah, I've made all your notes, and that was a question I had for Whitney. I have a feeling it was a formatting issue. Section 137.